They wrote, for instance, that it feels like having no internal monologue, extreme difficulty concentrating, dull pain behind the eyes, inability to retain information, feels like I've lived a continuous day for over 2 calendar years. I don't feel like I'm at the wheel. So it seems like it would be easy to know if you had sleep apnea, but as I mentioned in my intro video, it's anything but easy. And in fact, sometimes you won't even know for years and years, maybe decades, like with me, until you figure out what was behind all that anxiety or depression or just fatigue. Especially if you have UARS, it can be one of the most difficult things to figure out and diagnose, much less treat. So, building on that first video from a while back, this is the first part of a 3-part series on navigating the medical system. And it kind of starts with yourself because, like I said, if it's so hard to realize that you even have an issue, how do you realize that you have an issue? It makes sense to start by asking, what does it feel like to have apnea or UARS or some other sleep disordered breathing? And turns out that's a tricky question because we as humans, we just get used to anything. And especially if this is a condition that's gotten progressively worse bit by bit over years, and you've had it for years, it's something that our brains just adapt to. And it's almost like, the fish doesn't realize it's swimming in water anymore. So that's definitely what happened to me. It may not happen to everyone. I think a lot of people develop it later in life and they've already established kind of a baseline they know, but they may not necessarily know that it's a sleep problem. Still, that question is relevant. What does it feel like? What are the symptoms? And one thing that I've noticed with people with UARS, myself included, is that oftentimes we don't feel tired, in that kind of normal sense where, if you're tired, you just kind of, it's almost like a nice feeling. It's like this kind of like this warm, kind of heavy, if you could just lay down, it'd be the greatest feeling ever, No, it's definitely not that. It's more like a really, really horrible deep exhaustion, like a fog that's just impenetrable. And you're not tired. In fact, often you're wired and just super stressed. But you're just running on empty. And so generally, that feeling of just stress and being wired for years, it really changed my life and affected everything. I'd say life just, compared to everybody else, it seemed around me, life seemed harder for me. I just had to put in double the amount of effort and it was tough, and my baseline mood was off. I definitely had depression, anxiety. I had to focus on one of either 3 things, working, studying, my social life, or exercising, being fit. It didn't seem to be able to do all 3. Sure, it's difficult for other people as well to keep those balanced and juggle them, but it seemed much more difficult in my case. And it's just this feeling. It's really hard to describe. Actually, it's this feeling of fatigue. And somebody wrote in a Reddit once, and they seemed to hit the nail on the head. They wrote, for instance, that it feels like having no internal monologue, extreme difficulty concentrating, dull pain behind the eyes, inability to retain information, paranoia, feels like I've lived a continuous day for over 2 calendar years, like early onset dementia, like I'm lobotomized. I don't feel like I'm at the wheel. And then this user goes on to say, for me, at their peak, the symptoms are so overwhelming that I find myself unable to describe them verbally or in writing. And then what I love the most about this description is when they list a bunch of dark or confusing, strange movies and say, toss these films into a blender and you might have yourself an existential smoothie of the harrowingly depraved depth UARS OSA can subjectively plummet to. It's a really great description because it almost doesn't make any sense. And you can't make sense of this feeling. And other people just describe it very simply as daily torture. And it's not exaggerating because I know what it feels like. There are just days where you can't do anything and you feel trapped pretty much in your body and your mind. And yeah, it's this invisible condition, and it makes thinking, speaking, even feeling coherent emotions pretty much impossible. And just to be clear, it's not that bad for everybody. And I don't think it was for me in the beginning, but it progressively got worse over the years. It started for me around age 12 or 13, and mornings were pretty much, nightmare. I remember this for years, getting out of bed for school, was just impossible. I couldn't focus in school. And when I got home, I pretty much collapsed in front of the TV. I couldn't do much. I wanted to do things. I really wanted to play guitar, join sports, spend more time with friends, but it just felt impossible. So instead, I just got into a lot of stupid shit at that age. But that's another story. Maybe another time I'll tell you about that. But anyways, but then I found caffeine, and that helped get me through high school, college, master's. But it pretty much destroyed my sleep, drinking 5, 6 cups of coffee every day just to get through. And my anxiety went through the roof. So it got to a point where I was basically a recluse for a lot of the time that I was studying. I was still able to function. I got really good grades. Maybe that was kind of a coping mechanism just to focus on work. But I did have a few amazing relationships, but everything seemed to take, again, twice the amount of effort. So I had to repeat things over and over just to remember them. Social interactions, interestingly, were really draining. And something that was interesting, I could never find the right words to express myself. I felt disconnected from my own speech. And I mentioned the language thing because it's interesting that severe prolonged sleep deprivation can, disrupt the brain areas that are essentially responsible for language, the parts that, help us find words and form sentences. And in extreme cases, people can temporarily lose the ability to speak properly. And that happened to me once. So in 2010, after a very intense year studying abroad in Egypt, where we didn't really prioritize sleep, to be honest. It was an intense year. I came back to Germany, and turns out I forgot my German. I couldn't speak this language that I grew up with and I was fluent in. And my friends in Germany thought I had a stroke. And they were like, "What is wrong with you? You can't speak German anymore all of a sudden?" And so, yeah, that was very scary. The language eventually came back, but strange. It was very strange. So, how do you know that you have an underlying sleep condition? Well, there I can only speak from my own experience. For me, I always just knew something was off, but I thought it was me or something that I was doing. So, in college, I tried therapy, medications, exercising, just generally being fit, good diet. Later on, I tried different lifestyle changes, intermittent fasting, keto, perfect sleep hygiene. Nothing seemed to help. And as I discussed in my last video, doctors just never suspected sleep apnea in someone like me who's young, skinny, fit, etc. The system just isn't built to screen for obstructive sleep apnea in somebody like me. And UARS was even less known back then as it is now. It's still underappreciated. But how I kind of eventually figured it out was in 2014, finally had time because I went to Washington, D.C. for an internship, but it fell through. So I suddenly had months with nothing to do except to take Turkish classes and focus on my health to see if I could finally feel better. And there I, just did everything I could. I quit smoking, quit all caffeine, worked out a lot, and I started meditating. And meditating was something that I think was really important for me at the time because for years, probably over a decade, I had been kind of drowning out these signals that my brain was sending me that, hey, something's not right. And I was always on high alert in this anxious mode. So I had essentially, by this time, disconnected my body from my mind. And I think that's a big reason why I just took everything for granted. Like this was my new normal, this anxious state that I was in. So I had to first reestablish that mind-body connection to really figure out, hey, something is wrong, and what it is my sleep. Also bought one of those early Fitbit trackers. It was really bad. They're not accurate at all, especially back then. But just seeing the sleep graphs every day kind of planted the thought that sleep could really be the issue. Even though most of the time it was in the green. So these sleep trackers just really aren't that good. I don't want to make a video on it in the future. But in any case, even after months of really healthy living, I still felt awful. And one day after meditating, probably, it just hit me like a brick. It has to be my sleep. So it was a really strange moment of realization, to be honest. It seems so obvious. And the reason I'm exhausted is sleep sucks. But also not at all, again, because it doesn't feel like exhaustion. It's more like a wired, stressful state. And I never felt tired, really, more just discombobulated. So After that realization, I went to the university doctor when I got back home, got a referral. Within a couple months, I was in a sleep lab. So to summarize and looking back, there were just a few things that really helped me realize that I had a sleeping condition. And one was just really paying attention to my body, reconnecting to myself, and describing to myself how I was feeling. So every morning when I woke up, um, just thinking about how I felt and whether it was a good feeling or not, and what could be the reason why I was feeling the way I was feeling. Second, recognizing just that sleep affects everything from mood, focus to social life and relationships. It's like Andrew Huberman says pretty much in every one of his podcasts, sleep is the foundation of health. And it's so true. And so most of the symptoms that I was experiencing just had one common denominator, and that was sleep. Third is really improving sleep hygiene. So ruling out the basics, cutting out caffeine, alcohol, etc. Having good sleep hygiene, just making sure that those aren't the things that really are affecting you the most. And a tracker, which was helpful for me to just stay aware and not even track so much, because again, they're not so accurate. But and then finally, pushing for a referral when things didn't improve. Just making sure that you talk to your doctor, and even if they say, well, it's probably not a sleep disordered breathing condition or a sleep condition, that you make sure that you get what you need. And that's the thing. And if you suspect sleep disordered breathing, your first step is just to rule out the basics. And if weeks of healthy habits don't help you, you should probably get tested, either at a sleep lab or with an at-home device like a watch pad, one that's accurate. So if you catch it early, you'll save yourself years of struggle, probably, and damage and harm to your body, even if it seems manageable now. Sleep disordered breathing is a chronic progressive disease, so it tends to get worse over time. What's ironic is that severe cases are usually easier to catch. So, they come with night sweats. You'll wake up with a pounding heart and gasping for air, going to the bathroom a lot. Not necessarily, but typically there's something that you're going to notice about your sleep that's just off. Milder cases, on the other hand, can go undiagnosed for years or decades. So if you suspect sleep disordered breathing, definitely get it tested. And that's not doctor's advice, by the way. I think that's just common sense. So please take care of yourselves. And then just to wrap this up on why it matters, UARS and OSA are so common, so underappreciated, so underdiagnosed, and the impact on quality of life, health, and lifespan is just so huge that we need more screening and research for sure. And definitely also just general awareness. People need to be more aware that this is a thing and that they can have it. That's why I put this video out there. I hope it will be helpful to somebody in the future. And yeah, not a day goes by really that just don't think about the trauma this condition has caused me and probably others through me. But just in terms of the missed opportunities and missed connections with others, the inability to fully participate in life in many contexts, many ways. And yeah, even when I did, and I've done a lot of cool things in my life, there was always just something hanging over it. This exhausted feeling, the feeling of just trying to get through the day and just trying to keep it together. It's a tough one. So if this helps anybody, get to treatment a little bit faster, realize what's going on, then that's great. And next time I want to talk about how to actually, move on to get a diagnosis and different ways of doing that, but also how to navigate the medical system without losing your mind in the process a bit. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you soon.